Now that I've completed the 101 videos on the 4 Mediguns, it's time to focus on the melees. And while the Amputator VIta-saw and Stock will be getting their own, undoubtedly shorter videos at some point, I felt the two kings of medic melees needed to be combined into a single discussion. While the other options may have niche scenarios where they are stronger or just more fun to use, when discussing the best medic melee, the Ubersaw and Solemn Vow are not only very far ahead of the pack, but also very close to each other in relative power. So it just made sense to make a sort of pros versus cons comparison video rather than separate dedicated videos. We'll start with a simple overview of the stats of each weapon, then dive deeper into utilizing them to their fullest potential and my recommendations depending on your chosen medigun and preferred playstyle. Starting with the Ubersaw, although I'm pretty sure everyone knows the selling point of this weapon. You trade 20% swing speed for an instant 25% Uber charge when successfully landing a melee hit on an enemy. The only caveat is disguised spies and players with a stock Uber charge active. They won't give you any percent. However, cloaked but not disguised spies and scouts made invulnerable from bonk still grant the 25% on hit. In specific contexts where a scout is, I don't know, trying to bonk in to draw fire from your sentry nest, you can take extreme advantage of a player that doesn't know this little fact. Please, scout players, don't let this happen to the rest of your team. They're innocent. Or do, as long as I'm the medic on defense. Another quirk of the Ubersaw is its unique taunt. Taunting with the Ubersaw performs the spinal tap taunt, which will stun and then kill any players caught in a hitbox after the windup, similar to the Huntsman and Gunslinger taunts. Spinal tap also provides Uber charge, 25% on the initial hit that does 1 damage and stuns the opponent, and an additional 75% on the pullback that kills. And strangely, performing the taunt on a disguised spy does give you 50% Uber charge, even though a normal swing gives you nothing. The actual vial on the Ubersaw also fills up alongside your Uber charge percentage. So technically speaking, if you're really aware and you see an enemy medic Ubersawing a teammate, you can actually approximate their percentage and position around any advantage or disadvantage you notice. The Solemn Vow is also slapped with a swing speed negative, but at only 10%, it's not quite as heavy as the Ubersaw. The upside is the ability to see enemies' exact health value and Uber charge percent in the case of medics as long as you have line of sight and your crosshair is over their model. This effect is entirely passive. You do not need the weapon currently out to get the info, and that's pretty much all they do. Here's a comparison of the swing speeds compared to stock, and of course, they all do the standard 65 damage per hit. Sure feels good to finally talk about weapons that don't have a bunch of unique interactions or hidden passives, so this section of the video doesn't take 10 minutes. But I suppose that's the nature of melee weapons in TF2. They usually don't do a whole lot, and when it comes to medic melees in general, they're kind of small accents and bonuses to your chosen medigun. However, the Ubersaw and Solemn Vow are at complete opposite ends of the spectrum regarding what behaviors the weapons are encouraging. We're going to start with the Ubersaw because once we compare it with the Solemn Vow, this video will take a turn. And I need you all to know that I think the Ubersaw is a fantastic weapon. It is by far one of the strongest melees in the entire game. I have long said that Uber charge is the most important advantage a medic provides his team. Heals and buffs are also extremely powerful, but Ubers win games. Plain and simple. The Ubersaw gives medics something he desperately wants in the same way the crossbow does in the primary slot. So it is no surprise that this weapon absolutely dominates usage statistics. It's a little hard to find more modern data, but hey, it's not like this game has been updated recently. This website has the Ubersaw at almost a 69% usage rate, with only the sapper and crossbow being higher equipped across the whole game. And this older data from 2017 seems to corroborate that number fairly closely. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you have the Ubersaw equipped in your medic loadout, or you don't own it because you're too new to complete 22 medic achievements. And that all stems from the downside of the Ubersaw not really being a downside at all. The minus 20% firing speed increases your attack interval with the weapon from a whole 0.8 seconds to 0.96 seconds between swings. If you're doing the melee dance most players do by strafing back and forth, waiting to time a swing, then all the downside really does is add a small amount of delay or perceived lag to each of your swings. I won't say this will never matter, because in a situation where an enemy swings their melee at about the same tick server side, you will lose that engagement since their swing will do damage ever so slightly earlier. But that specific scenario crops up few and far between, not even close to once per match. And getting an instant 25% Uber has a few benefits beyond the obvious reaching 100% slightly faster so you can make your big team push sooner. When I play medic, even in casual, I play on a bit of an internal timer around enemy medics Uber charge, where if they haven't died or used for about 40 seconds, I start to play way less aggressively, so I'm not caught out by an enemy pop.
They're gonna have crits here. I should play back and spawn. Preserve my KD. Watch this. Crits in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Oh my, dude, am I cheating? If their medic gets a few Ubersaws off on my spy, then they would be able to catch me out of position with a pop much sooner than I expect. Of course, most medics in casual aren't going to be Uber tracking like that, but it's an unseen benefit of getting to 100% faster, like picking up a fallen medic's Medigun. Secondly, with an Ubersaw equipped, being at any percentage above 75 means you're at 100% and can pop by hitting a single swing. And with the Vaccinator, any hit is an instant bubble when you switch back to your Medigun. In a world where all Mediguns except the crit screen provide you with some form of survivability, a clutch swing, then switch and pop can sometimes save your life. You can even take this idea one step further and use the Ubersaw to extend your Medigun's Uber charge duration. While switching to the Ubersaw during an Uber is not the most advised decision because you and your patient instantly lose the bonuses, if you really don't have any other choice or the enemy just lets you do it, it can be used to extend your Uber charge beyond the standard 8-second duration if you manage to live long enough to switch back. There's no two ways about it. The Ubersaw is a fantastic melee weapon, and its clutch potential is second to none on Medic. Take this clip on Barn Blitz going into overtime. The situation seemed completely hopeless until this spy showed up and gifted me the Uber we needed to cap. These are those clutch moments where Saw feels truly busted, and I had to discuss the benefits of the Ubersaw in the name of being thorough, but I didn't want to spend too long because I'm sure everything just presented to you was not new in the slightest. Everyone talks about and recommends the Ubersaw, and the upsides are quite obvious. But over the years of maining Medic, I haven't seen as much discussion on the dark side of this melee. I personally don't think this weapon is the end-all be-all of Medic melees, and by the end of the video, I think you'll agree with me or at least see where I'm coming from. Ubersaw's issues are rooted in the condition a medic must fulfill to reap that 25% reward. You need to hit an enemy class successfully, then live to tell the tale. This is not something medic typically wants to do or even attempt in a given match of TF2. In fact, usually, your entire goal of existence on medic is to avoid those situations where self-defense or fighting enemies is required entirely, perhaps aside from some long-range crossbow spam, but I don't think that counts as you aren't really fighting a player directly. It just happens that even though the Ubersaw's means to its reward is counterintuitive to Medic's optimal playstyle at large, the benefit of 25% is so objectively good that the weapon is still quite potent. But think about it. Without the Ubersaw equipped, the only time you would ever attempt to melee an enemy on Medic is in times of desperation. But with the Ubersaw, we all know that isn't the case. Come on, I know you've been baited in by trying to get that extra hit because I've been baited in by the allure of some seemingly free charge from an unsuspecting enemy, only to be caught out and die, effectively losing Uber instead of gaining any. Don't even get me started on how many medics I've seen chase after a spy only to be face stabbed or trick stabbed as spy mains prefer to call it, or just straight up run melee first into the enemy frontline because they're wearing Ubersaw blinders and all they can see is that juicy percent. This is why we need to take the Ubersaw out of people's hands, dude. How is that guy so healthy? The medic just runs into him, dude. The hardest part of using the Ubersaw is not using it, not falling victim to aggressive Ubersaw syndrome, knowing when trying to get that extra hit off is not worth the risk, and you are much better off just walking away, trying to surf out, or even using your primary in self-defense instead. It's a more complex skill than most medics realize. The fact is, going for an Ubersaw swing is always a gamble, and medic just isn't a gambling class. Sure, there are times where it's a lower risk than others, but it will almost always be at least slightly riskier than the other option, getting out of dodge or buying time for your teammates to hopefully protect you instead. My best Saw tip to medics wanting to improve is to take the extra 25% only when it is given to you. Do not play the game seeking it out. If a free-to-play spy or bonk scout walks up to you, sure, drop whatever else you're doing and try to grab some free charge. Other than that, treat the Ubersaw as a weapon that sometimes lets you walk away from unavoidable self-defense situations with some free percent. Basically, read the weapon's description as extra 25% Uber when surviving a 1v1. But even with it equipped, you should be doing all in your power to avoid those 1v1s. Medic is about consistency above all, minimizing mistakes and deaths. Getting into a 1v1 is a mistake in the first place that probably should have been avoided and is highly unlikely to turn out well for you. It being an unavoidable mistake with how many factors are at play in a 12v12 match does make the Ubersaw a strong melee. But remember, that 1v1 was a mistake nonetheless. The problem I see with some medics is if you manage to 1v1 a scout and walk away with with an extra 50% Uber as reward, you might be inclined to think you just did something correctly. I mean, you're probably thinking, hey, not only did I live, but I got half a charge off the enemy as well. The Ubersaw's pretty busted. But what you should be thinking is, how did I put myself in a position where I had to 1v1 a scout and live in the first place? And how can I position differently in the future so this doesn't happen again? Unfortunately, uniquely with the Ubersaw, most players are more inclined to think the first rather than the latter. So they won't develop their positioning to avoid 1v1s because they know they are heavily rewarded for it on the off chance they actually win the engagement. And the presence of random crits only makes the situation so much worse. Look, nowadays I pretty much exclusively play Sixes or Uncle Topia, both of which have random crits disabled. And while I believe random crits make medics slightly worse overall compared to classes like Soldier or Demo who are undoubtedly buffed by their presence, the Ubersaw is the one medic weapon that disproportionately benefits. Being able to have a chance to instantly kill most classes in self-defense and still get that extra Uber charge is crazy. But at the same time, it makes that situation of being baited into fights you just shouldn't be taking that much worse for inexperienced medics. So many medics have this idea entrenched in their minds that when cornered, the default response should be, I pull out my Ubersaw and hope for a random crit. And I cannot understate just how bad of a mindset that is. Because if you roll the dice and get lucky, you walk away thinking that you have made a correct decision, when in reality, you likely made a critical error in your positioning that led you to relying on a random crit to survive in the first place. And when you don't get the random crit, you justify the death away as, aw, no crit, unlucky. You're still not addressing the underlying issue with awareness or positioning. I know I'm calling out some of you watching this right now, but you need to hear this. That mindset right there is preventing you from fixing those missteps and hindering your progress as a medic.
This heavy is such a new player. I like it. I got spooked. What is this guy doing? What? Run him! Get him! Oh my.
And let me also put to rest the classic, but Ubersaw always crits comments that I know I'm gonna get. It doesn't. Increased random crit chance is a myth on Medic. Crit chance doesn't increase from healing, patient damage, etc. Medic, just like the other 8 classes, only receives increased crit chance from direct damage to enemies. I tested all of these situations myself a few years ago. Making a play where you need a random crit for it to work out is never advised, and it should only be attempted if your back is against the wall and you have no other choice. The ongoing belief that Medic does have a higher crit chance is likely a combination of community-wide confirmation bias and the fact that if you don't roll a crit on the first swing, you just dealt 65 damage and have substantially increased your crit chance for the next 20 seconds. Nobody remembers all the times the medic didn't crit and just dies because that's the expected result when you corner a medic. You only remember the times the med got lucky. That's not to say you can't use the threat of an Ubersaw crit to your advantage. Something that I have recently started doing in those clutch situations where I need to buy time for my teammates to kill the enemy currently focusing me down is pulling out my melee but not actually going for the swing. My reasoning is while I'm not attempting to kill the enemy myself, I can buy time by whipping out my melee and backing up, possibly causing the enemy gamer to miss a shot or two as they are probably expecting me to walk forward for the swing. You can do this on any melee, but it might be slightly better with the Ubersaw just because of how players have been conditioned over all these years. When's the last time you were trying to kill a medic and after whipping out the Ubersaw, they ran away instead of even attempting a swing? I'll also note that this strategy is just an attempt to buy some time after being caught out. If you happen to have a friendly scout, you should always attach beam to them instead, as the extra speed will be a much surer way to juke around and avoid damage than playing medic melee mind games. Now here's the thing before we move on to the Solemn Vow. All these downsides I just discussed of being baited in or not improving as fast as you could, I'm sure were valuable for some of you to hear, but they're all what I would call self-imposed downsides. If you are using the weapon intelligently, can't you just get all the upsides of the Uber on hit, with the only actual downside being the essentially non-existent swing speed penalty? And yeah, you absolutely can, but I had to discuss those ideas as they are downsides most detrimental to newer medic players that are still working on all the basics of heal order, positioning, and awareness. I genuinely think the non-stop just equip the Ubersaw recommendations to new players leads many medics to develop bad habits they need to unlearn later once they start figuring the class out. My recommendation to new medics is to avoid the Ubersaw entirely until you are consistently living long enough to get your Uber most lives. Once you're able to do that, you know enough about the game to start making correct decisions when it comes to risking an Ubersaw swing or not. In fact, I'd go so far as to say brand new medics would be better served staying on stock bone saw, even though it's a worse weapon because it will correctly teach them that melee should never be relied on as medic. Or better yet, the Solemn Vow, but we haven't gotten to that part of the video yet. I know this completely goes against the grain of the overall community, but I think it's for the best. And now we can talk about the actual downside of the weapon. Because yes, the Ubersaw does have a downside beyond the swing speed that I honestly don't see discussed enough. It is a win more weapon. What I mean by this is the Ubersaw is undoubtedly more effective the worse the players on the enemy team are. It's just a fact that getting a melee off and living as medic rarely happens against any remotely competent damage class. This is another one of those situations like quick fix overheal that's hard to quantify in its game-to-game impact, but the trend is clear to see. The Ubersaw's effectiveness has an inverse relationship with the average skill of the enemy team. Win more weapons such as this, especially on medic, are often very counterproductive. The Ubersaw will be most impactful in games against enemies that consistently let you get melee hits off, but if you're playing against a team that is letting you get that many swings off and live as a medic, did you really need the extra charge from those swings to win that game in the first place? Conversely, the challenging games against more competent enemies will result in significantly less value for the weapon, precisely when you need it the most. Now, I'm not ignorant to how many factors go into any given match. The enemy team could have an insane demo man frontlining, but also have a brand new spy feeding you charge. Even against competent players, beef is bound to happen, and the clutch potential is always there. But it's undeniable that the higher skill environment you play in, the more critical it becomes to be consistent as medic and take as few risks as possible, meaning taking fewer melee fights that could end in your death, resulting in the Ubersaw getting weaker and weaker. You know what weapon doesn't have this problem? It's finally time to talk about Rocky Ronald. Look, I was like you once. I didn't start playing the game until solidly after Jungle Inferno, and by then, the more casual community had already entrenched the Ubersaw as the one and only medic melee if you're playing seriously. Looking at the weapon stats on paper, it's clear to see why this has been the general zeitgeist of casual TF2 for the last decade. How could simply seeing enemy health and charge values compete with an instant 25% Uber? But I'm telling you, it doesn't have to be this way. The Solemn Vow is the complete antithesis of the Ubersaw in regards to usage. It continues to get better as the average skill level increases across teams. Years ago, it was even banned from competitive sixes for a time, which probably further explains the Ubersaw's dominant market share. However, several years ago, for RGL Season 3, the Solemn Vow was unbanned, and its usage has only become more and more prevalent in sixes. There's a great article on TFTV after the first season of the weapon's unban, with Invite Medics being some of the first to convert over, going from a measly 3% equip rate to 22% by the end of the season. Nowadays, I can probably count on one hand the number of Ubersaw plays I've seen in sixes, even after playing for several seasons myself. I mean, it's no big surprise. The melee weapon that provides an entirely passive upside is the best option for a class that never wants to melee under ideal circumstances. And while your teammates will be making damage callouts in comp, sometimes comms are cluttered, or multiple teammates hit one player for a modest amount of health. It's always nice to be able to tell your soldiers, hey, their demo's only 50 health on a mid-fight. However, the main selling point of the weapon in sixes is seeing the opponent's exact Uber percentage during some plays. Tracking the enemy medic's Uber charge is a critical foundation of sixes, but TF2 is messy, and tracking is always going to be an assumption. Being able to know for sure if the enemy medic is going to get Uber during a fight or not, and communicating it to the rest of your team can be round winning. For example, if we're pushing in on what should be around 30% advantage, killing the enemy medic is a high priority, or else he could get to 100% and use his Uber to turn the fight around.
Don't worry about him. Don't worry about him. You can deal with that. I'm going fast.
They're playing toxic. What?
Yeah, they're toxic. Oh my god, we're behind them. Yes.
They're 90-90. Kill, kill, kill.
I missed everything. The match back up here with me. Nice.
Got him in.
Yep. Got 100 on you. Scout lower. Be careful.
Soldier behind. Be careful.
Yeah, let's get mid.
Alternatively, if the medic wasn't building well and your assumed 30% ad is actually around 50%, telling your team that the medic is no longer the priority will instead let your teammates focus fire on the opposing explosive classes, stopping you from capping.
Alright, let's get in the lobby.
Watch for a sniper or something.
Yeah, we have to
Everybody
start med with this.
They have a sniper watching left.
I have some
I just want to use to right.
Alright.
Good,
go, Dan.
Oh my god. I need help. That's a
I'm dead.
They were left.
In left.
Soldier left as well.
Soldier.
I took 30.
Get rehealed.
They're only 60%. Don't worry about med. Don't worry about med. Only 60.
Shooting heavy now.
Yeah, focus
I'm
heavy.
hitting 90 now. 120.
Fight here, fight.
Heavy's dead.
Focus
Shoot
scout.
the scout on point. Shoot the scout.
Soldier behind you.
Nice.
And I know that in Highlander it's less used because the near constant threat of Sniper turning Medic into a glorified dispenser that can't peek any sightlines in conjunction with a permanent spy player that can see and communicate the same information while remaining invisible does make the effect overall less valuable. So you might as well just run something else. At this point you may be thinking, that's great theory. Of course, Solemn Vow is strong in a competitive setting where the information it provides can be communicated and acted upon quickly, but Ubersaw must still be king in casual. I mean, in casual, you may not be communicating with anyone, so what good is the information provided by the weapon? That's the consensus I've seen at least. The info just isn't helpful if you aren't relaying it to competent teammates. But I'm here to say that take simply stems from a lack of experience. None of the information provided by the Solemn Vow is useless even if you aren't using voice chat at all. And if you think it is, you just don't know what to do with it. The Solemn Vow cannot be bad for one simple reason. TF2 and especially Medic is best played from a top-down game state approach. How you make decisions on Medic stems, or at least should stem, from the overall state of the match in that given snapshot. This is why I have to go into so much detail in these guides. To put it bluntly, a guide that just tells you to memorize a specific heal order or that Ubering demo is always best is almost useless. Trying to memorize a playstyle as if it's a flowchart will only help short term and you will plateau skill-wise. What's important is the why behind the decisions of healing a particular player, switching to crossbow and arrowing instead of beaming, backing up at certain times but playing aggressively in others. So I focus on that decision-making process first, then explain the trends that pop up. Such as, yeah, it is often the best option to Uber your demo, but if you don't understand why it's often the best option, then you will inevitably Uber your demo at the wrong time while still thinking it's correct because that's what you've been told. And that why behind a given decision needs to be informed based on the game state. What advantages does your team have and what disadvantages do you have? Do you have more players alive than the enemy team, letting you play more aggressively and push your advantage? Do you know the enemy medic is getting close to a crits charge, so you need to play it safe and avoid dying to the pop? Taking in as much information about the game and using it to decide in the moment what your next move needs to be is by far the most effective way to play Medic. It also leads to a simple feedback loop of improvement. When you die or just make a mistake, it's often for one of two reasons. You missed some vital piece of info about the game state, which led you to make a suboptimal decision. You didn't play correctly around an enemy Uber charge or didn't notice half your team was dead. You weren't spy checking and got stabbed. You walked straight into a common sniper sightline. By taking 5 seconds to reflect after your death, now you know what to be more cognizant of when a similar situation crops up in the future. If you hadn't missed that key piece of information, you would have made a different decision and probably been fine. The other way you falter is by having good information but drawing the wrong conclusion. You know you have Uber ad and you still played it safe instead of using your advantage. You knew they had a flank happy scout and you still played in a position he could easily get to you. You chose not to arrow tank your heavy because you're close to Uber, but he ended up dying before you got 100%. In these situations, you knew enough about the game state to make the best decision, but you just didn't for whatever reason. These are the deaths or mistakes where you instantly stop and think to yourself, oh, if I only did that instead, this play probably would have worked out. Boom, you've just improved a little because now in the future, you will make a better decision. It's that easy. I know that was a bit long-winded, but I had to point out how pretty much all information when playing Medic is actionable. So the Solemn Vow giving you access to info you wouldn't usually have and passively to boot makes it inherently strong. It just isn't flashy at all with what it gives you. You can feel the Ubersaw's power when you walk away from the corpse of some would-be hero with an extra 50% to your name. It's much harder to feel the power and impact the Solemn Vow has on your game outside of those competitive situations mentioned earlier. But you also have to think about just how often you can make use of the Vow compared to the Saw. It's not uncommon to go an entire match without ever swinging your melee. In fact, the better you get at positioning, the less and less you'll be caught out and even need to defend yourself. So we're back at only using the Ubersaw when an enemy is atrocious and essentially gives it to you for free. That isn't a given, even in casual. Meanwhile, regardless of team composition or general skill levels, the Vow will be useful because you're always going to be able to make use of its upside. It takes information that would normally only be available in snapshot moments. Seeing the enemy eat a rocket or pill the second it happens so you know they're down 100 health and makes it available continuously with line of sight. So let me show you the ways I use it and make the most of that info in casual. The main thing it does is help keep you alive, and it does so in 3 different ways. Firstly, it naturally turns off that little voice in the back of your head. You know, the one that tempts you with whispers. That spy could be an easy 25% if you pull out your Ubersaw and hold W. I have noticeably fewer casual deaths when I don't always see melee as a chance to get free Uber. As much self-control as you can have, it's often better to not ever have that thought enter your brain. Of course, you lose a little bit of the melee baiting strategy we discussed earlier because players will be less wary of you getting a swing off when the chips are down, but I think it's a more than fair trade-off. The second and most important way of using the info provided by the Vow is just looking at enemy health values to give you a better sense of who really has the advantage in a fight. All the time, I will be healing up a teammate as they enter an engagement, and because I'm on Solemn Vow, I instantly know if the enemy they're fighting is half health or has a full buff, which in turn instantly lets me respond accordingly. This is one of those snapshot moments. I can decide to arrow my teammate because they're probably going to lose the fight without some extra juice, leave beam on because I can see they are already healthier, or just back out entirely if the enemy has significantly more health without any guesswork involved. Many times, I have started backing away instantly as I saw my 200 health heavy rev into a 450 heavy because I already know the outcome of that fight. You're just a bit less in the dark about how things are going to play out, and making that decision to leave now instead of in 2 seconds when your teammate inevitably loses that fight can easily be the difference between escaping and dying. You can even know if you should go for an arrow on a low health teammate in a 1v1 or if you can arrow the enemy and heal them up afterwards without ever having to actually rely on your teammate's skill to finish them off.
I got you. Never arrow your teammate when you can just arrow and kill the enemy. Because you're using Solemn Vow. Pro tip. I'm out of arrows.
And not only does knowing that little bit extra help you make more nuanced decisions around positioning with your teammates, but it also helps tremendously in those scenarios where you are caught out and have to try to win a 1v1. By knowing your aggressor's health, you, by extension, always know the optimal way to approach a fight. Trying to survive an encounter with a soldier that has 30 health can be played a lot differently than a soldier with 200. If it will only take a single crossbow or two, it's pretty easy to deal with the player yourself. But if this soldier is 200, your best option is likely hitting a surf and buying time for teammates to show up rather than trying to secure the kill yourself. Knowing the exact health of the enemy trying to kill you lets you decide how best to survive the encounter, a decision you just cannot make with the same accuracy with any other melee equipped. And even when not directly engaged with an enemy, combining the inverse damage fall off of the Crusader's crossbow with the ability to see low health enemies, let's just say it turns you into a bit of a pick class, albeit a very weak pick class, but you can usually secure a couple of extra kills per match. Normally, spamming arrows at enemies hoping they die is kind of a waste of time on Medic. You probably have better things to do, like arrowing your teammate or building your Uber, but when you can see their health, you know for sure whether they'll live or not. Meaning if you don't have something else you absolutely need to be doing, lobbing an arrow at an unsuspecting enemy that will guarantee die if you hit suddenly becomes a worthwhile endeavor. It makes the already absurd Crusaders a bit better because this isn't exactly something you can take advantage of with a syringe gun. Plus, it's just fun, and players never expect it.
Oh, exactly 75 HP. Don't mind if I do.
Even when you are in a situation where you have better things to do than switch to crossbow and try finishing off an enemy, just knowing that their soldier, demo, heavy, whatever is super low and will have to back up is valuable information. Now that's one less threat you need to worry about for the time being. Constantly checking the health of enemies does have a bit of a learning curve. By now it's second nature to me, but when first using the Vow, it'll be something to get used to. But it's not like you need to check the health of every single enemy player that enters your line of sight. That will become far too overwhelming. When not in do or die situations, I find myself mainly checking the health of the enemy frontliners that my team is shooting at, or players that I already saw take considerable damage. If they aren't low enough to die in a single bolt or directly fighting me or my pocket, their health doesn't matter very much. You can only focus on so many things at once, so you have to get used to identifying those moments it can actually make a difference, and those moments where it's better to ignore it and look somewhere else. And I've noticed that using the Vow to confirm player health values has definitely improved my ability to somewhat track enemies' health, even when not having it equipped or playing another class. In this sense, it helps build a skill that usually gets sidelined on Medic, which in turn can lead to some pretty out there shots.
Oh my god, dude. He's so mad. He's so mad.
Lastly, even though it's not nearly as impactful and casual as it is in 6s, sometimes getting a glimpse of the opposing medic's current charge is always nice. It'll concretely let you know whether you have an uber advantage and you can play aggressively and push with it, or a disadvantage you need to play around. So that's how the Solemn Vow and Ubersaw stack up against each other in general, but we still missed an essential aspect of these options that I cannot ignore: the Medigun you have equipped alongside your melee. The different Mediguns encourage alternate playstyles, and the 25% gained from an Ubersaw swing could be 25% of a stock Uber or 25% of a quick fix. Starting off with stock, Ubersaw is disproportionately powerful because not only is invuln the best overall charge in the game, but it also takes the longest to build. Extending a stock Uber is not quite as risky since you become invincible again as soon as you switch back to the Medigun, and being able to get a swing off at 75% plus then pop to save yourself with the charge is more potent on stock because, again, complete invincibility. The scout actively killing you in a 1v1 isn't really going to care if you swap back and pop a crits charge. Simply put, an instant 25% on stock is way better than an instant 25% on any other Medigun. I would say that on average, the Ubersaw has a slight edge in casual utility compared to the Solemn Vow. The Vow will always be the safe option. If you find yourself being baited in by the allure of 25% too often or are really new to the medic class, I'd recommend you shelf the Ubersaw for a while, but I just can't deny that its clutch potential with invuln can be insane. Ubersaw is by no means bad on quick fix, but it is not nearly as strong as on stock. It's a lot riskier to go for any type of Uber extend or clutch play without the instant invulnerability that stock provides. You could still try it or get a few clutch swings off and transition into a pop to save yourself, but without being invincible, some of those times you're just going to die where you definitely would have lived with invuln.
I'm gonna pop quick fix on this guy and he's gonna die to a huntsman arrow. How am I so good at calling things like that? Whoa.
Additionally, glimpsing an enemy's Uber charge with Vow is more useful on quick fix. Due to the nature of its weaker Uber charge, you can't go head to head with the likes of a stock Uber or especially a Crits Krieg. If you're gearing up for a push and are able to notice the enemy medic is also ready with their charge, it'll let you transition more into damage control rather than a fully offensive pop where you could easily overextend and die to their counter. I personally haven't run Saw on quick fix for a long time now, and I can't say that I've missed it. Crits Krieg is an interesting case for the Ubersaw. It gives no defensive buffs whatsoever, so clutching and Uber extending is almost non-existent. It also builds 25% faster, inherently devaluing the 25% gain from a swing. By all reasonable accounts, the Vow is undeniably the better choice here, even giving you the ability to back out of a use if you see their medic has invuln ready to pop as you try to crits in. And yet, I find myself running Ubersaw almost exclusively on the Crits Krieg. Honestly, even more so than I do on stock. Look, when I'm running crits, I have one overarching goal: make it fat and get as high of a kill streak as possible. Only one weapon is theoretically gonna let me do that more often. Crits is the high risk, high reward metagun, and it's just more fun for me to pair it with the high risk, high reward melee. Just know that with Ubersaw and Crits Krieg, your mileage will definitely vary. Finally, the Vaccinator. Starting to use the Vac more and more is actually what made me give the Vow a try in the first place years ago when I was a young and impressionable medic main. I just wasn't feeling the Ubersaw with this metagun, even though the community at the time was still dead set on it being the end-all be-all. Yes, a swing gives you a bubble no matter what percent you're at, but you know what also gives you a bubble? Only 6 seconds of beam. Proper positioning and bubble management makes situations where you need to get the Ubersaw swing off for a bubble to save yourself few and far between. Knowing the enemy medic's percentage is also imperative on the Vaccinator. It tells you when you need to save a couple of bubbles to counter a potential pop, or when you can use all your charges aggressively to push your advantage. And with the generally more aggressive playstyle that Vac promotes, you're going to be in a position to have line of sight on an opposing medic much more often. And that specific use case of the passive discussed earlier about using the health of an enemy to determine whether you should just leave beam on, switch to arrow, or leave entirely when your pocket starts fighting them, well, now you'll instantly know if you need to pop a bubble or not, helping further with bubble management. Vow just has incredible synergy with the Vaccinator and is basically always the optimal choice. Picking anything else feels like a significant downgrade on this metagun. So yeah, if you're not always running stock, I can't recommend the Vow enough on the other 3 Mediguns. Again, you aren't initially going to feel the strength of the Solemn Vow as you would with the Ubersaw. You might even find yourself in situations where you kill an enemy and think, man, if I had the Ubersaw there, I would have gotten some free charge. And that is perfectly valid. In fact, I'll close this video by saying the best way to play medic in casual is to default default to the Solemn Vow, but switch to the Ubersaw if you notice some brain-dead enemies. Just like you might be inclined to switch to crits if you notice you have a demo with really strong DM skills on your team. Solemn Vow will always give you value, while Ubersaw is situational. But in the situation Saw is good, it's really good, and you should make the most of it. Still, I think on average, the Vow will help you more in those games that turn into a real grind to win. Think about it like this. While most of the time you play at your general skill level, every match or session has its ups and downs. We all have those games where we're just in a flow state, and your positioning is on point, you're hitting surfs and bows left and right, and every play you make seems to work out. On the other hand, we've had those games where nothing seems to go well. Flankers appear out of nowhere, and they have a top-tier sniper or spy that just seems to always find a way to pick you off. You know, the ones that follow Murphy's Law and are considerably less enjoyable. The big reason I find the Vow so useful and casual is how it makes you ever so slightly less dependent on teammates, and allows you to perform marginally better during those rough ones. On Medic, the goal of improving shouldn't be to play even better at your highs. It should be to reduce your mistakes and bring up your lows to a level that still lets you stay alive long enough to get some Ubers, keep people buffed and healthy, and just make a significant contribution to the team. So by now, I hope you realize that even though both of these melees are top tier, only one of them is likely to increase consistency in those tough matches. If you're a newer player or you're looking to actually improve at Medic, give the old Bust of Hippocrates a try. You won't regret it. And if you're looking to make some fat plays, go with the Ubersaw. You also won't regret it. But I hope you now at least have a slightly more nuanced perspective on Medic melees that isn't just Ubersaw or nothing. See, I told you I'd get you there.
Oh god. Oh god. Oh god, we unleashed a monster. We unleashed a monster. Dude, that may be the worst quick fix pop I've ever seen in my life.